Let's start slowly, with your place in the world. Not in a metaphorical sense, but quite literally, your place in the household, your rank among the many feet that shuffled across cold stone floors. In medieval society, hierarchy wasn't just a word, it was a physical reality, pressed into every waking moment. You didn't simply work in a house, you belonged to it. Not in the heartwarming way modern folks talk about feeling like family in the workplace. No, your belonging was closer to that of a broom or a bucket, used, worn, set aside, and replaced without fanfare. The medieval servant occupied a space at the bottom of the social pyramid, lower than apprentices, lower than beggars in some towns, and only just above slaves in regions where servitude took different forms. There were no illusions of upward mobility. Born into service, you would likely die in service. You weren't a character in a fairy tale who might marry into nobility. You were the character in the background, silently sweeping the floor while the story happened to someone else. This wasn't simply a job. You didn't apply to become a servant, or attend a training seminar, or negotiate your wages. More often than not, you were born into it. Your parents were servants, and their parents before them. If you weren't born into it, you were trapped by circumstances, debt, famine, orphanhood, or abandonment. For many, the only thing separating servitude from outright slavery was a thin line of language and legal framing, one that mattered little to the person washing the laundry or cleaning up after livestock. And what of dignity? That shimmering quality we like to assign every human life. In medieval households, dignity was a luxury, and it rarely trickled down. Servants didn't dine at the table. They didn't sit unless permitted. They didn't speak unless spoken to. Even eye contact could be risky, depending on the temperament of the master or mistress. Their bodies were tools, their thoughts unimportant, their presence required and yet invisible. Hierarchy ruled the servant world too. You were not simply a servant. You were a scullery maid, a spit boy, a laundry wink, a footman, a stable lad, each role with its own tiny rung on the miserable ladder. Some positions, like steward or chamberlain, held a touch more prestige, but for every one of those, there were dozens of nameless laborers doing the dirtiest, hardest, most thankless tasks. If you were low on this totem pole, you might spend your entire life without being addressed by name by anyone outside your rank. You were seen only when you failed. Spill a goblet of wine. The master notices. Forget to stoke the fire. The mistress complains. Perform perfectly, silently, tirelessly, and you remain a background noise, like the wind moaning through the halls. The best you could hope for was to go unnoticed. Attention was almost always a prelude to punishment. Your quarters reflected your status. You didn't live in the castle's warm upper chambers. You lived in cold stone rooms near the kitchens, the stables, or even the cellar. Your bed was straw stuffed in a coarse sack, often shared with others, always infested with lice. The smell never left, smoke, sweat, and mold, mixing together like an unholy incense. In winter, the cold bit your bones. In summer, the fleas and filth swarmed. And still, somehow, there were worse places. Outside the manor walls were fields full of peasants, serfs with their own share of hardship. But the difference was this: serfs, however poor, had a sliver of freedom over their days. A tiny hut, a family they might see, a piece of land to call theirs, even if it barely fed them. Servants had none of that. You lived where you worked, ate only if allowed, and slept with the knowledge that your labor was owned from sunup to sundown. The term, servant, hides a world of contradictions. You were part of the household, yet never truly inside it. You saw the nobles at their most vulnerable, in their baths, their bedrooms, their drunken evenings, and yet you were never allowed to exist as a person in their presence. You witnessed the secrets of the manor, knew its rhythms better than its owners, and still, your death would be unremarked upon. A servant gone. Simply bring in another. Children began young. A boy of 7 might run errands from sunup to dusk. A girl of 10 might be trusted with firewood and laundry. They were whipped for clumsiness, scolded for delays, and expected to smile and bow through it all. There were no childhoods, only preparation for a life of submission. Even religion offered little comfort. The church taught humility and obedience, reinforcing the idea that your suffering was part of God's plan. You were told to embrace your lot in life, to accept that paradise came after death, not in the dining hall of your master, but in some otherworldly reward you would never live to question. And yet, you worked on. Because what else could you do? Every breath you took belonged to someone else. Every hour was measured by another person's need. And if you dared to dream of freedom, of rest, of dignity, you buried it deep beneath the ashes in the hearth. Dreams were for those who could afford idleness. You were a servant. You were the lowest of the low. And you would be that until the very end. In the medieval world, no one asked you what you wanted to be when you grew up. You didn't dream of becoming a knight, a merchant, or a scholar. Those weren't doors that could be opened by effort or ambition. They were closed before you were even born. The path of your life was not chosen, it was handed to you, shaped by poverty, geography, lineage, and the subtle machinery of feudal obligation. You didn't become a servant because of a choice. You became one because you had no choice at all. The most common route into servitude was by birth. If your parents were servants, you almost certainly would be too. This was not seen as unusual or unfair, it was simply how life worked. A stable boy's son might grow up knowing the sounds and smells of horses before he could walk. A scullery maid's daughter would be wiping tables or stirring gruel as soon as her hands were strong enough to hold a spoon. These weren't jobs handed down through paperwork. They were inherited like a color or a family curse. There were other ways to become a servant, but they were equally grim. A common route was through debt. If your family couldn't pay a tax, a rent, or a fine, someone, usually the youngest, strongest, or most disposable, might be sent to serve in a lord's house as repayment. In theory, this was temporary. In reality, it was often for life. The debt didn't disappear, it simply changed shape, transforming from coins on a ledger into hours of unpaid labor. Orphanhood was another path. If your parents died, whether from plague, famine, war, or just the slow grind of poverty, you were left unmarked in a world with no safety nets. Local lords, priests, or townspeople might take you in, but this rarely meant kindness. You were clothed, perhaps, and fed, barely, but only in exchange for service. You were the charity case turned dishwasher, the poor child turned servant by the simple misfortune of being alone. No one expected gratitude. They expected obedience. In some cases, entire villages were obligated to provide servants to a lord's manor. This was part of the feudal system, a complicated, deeply unfair network of promises and obligations that ran not on laws, but on customs older than memory. A village might owe so many bushels of grain per year, and also 2 boys or girls of working age to serve in the house. The village elders decided who went. Usually, they chose the poorest family's child. You might wake up one morning expecting to gather firewood, only to be told you now belonged to the Lord's household. And just like that, your life would be uprooted. It's tempting to imagine there was some legal process to all this, but often there wasn't. No contracts, no formal hiring, no lists of duties or protections. A nod from a steward, a gesture from a noble, a quiet transaction between 2 men in cloaks, that was enough to decide your future. Paperwork was a luxury. Your existence as a servant might never be recorded at all. And of course, there were those who fell into servitude by desperation. A failed harvest, a fire, a brutal winter that left your home in ruins. You might walk for miles, blistered and starving, to the nearest manor house and beg for work. Not for a wage, but for food. A roof. A place to survive. The steward might look you over like livestock. Are you strong? Are you quiet? Can you work? If yes, you'd be taken in, given a cot in a corner. And from that day forward, your time was no longer yours. Parents sometimes sold their children into service, believing, perhaps rightly, that they'd be better off in a manor than starving at home. This was seen not as cruelty, but as pragmatism. A 10-year-old boy might be worth a few silver pennies to a desperate father. A teenage girl might be offered to a noble house to learn proper duties, though everyone knew what that sometimes meant. There was no rescue from this. Only silence. Once inside the system, you belonged to it. Even if you somehow earned a few coins, there were no shops, no escape routes, no starting over. Travel was dangerous and forbidden without permission. Letters were rare and mostly unreadable to servants who never learned to write. You might live your whole life within the walls of one estate, your world no bigger than its hallways and fields. Education was not offered to servants. There were no books, no tutors, no curious questions about what you wanted to learn. The only knowledge you gained was through work: how to light a fire without smoke, how to fold the linens just so, how to move soundlessly through a room. These were not skills of enrichment. They were skills of survival. Even within the servant class, your origin shaped your future. If you were born into the house, you might be more trusted. If you arrived by poverty, you might be watched closely for signs of theft. If you were an orphan, you might be pitied, but pity did not protect you from beatings or harsh orders. Everyone knew their rank, even among the invisible. The irony was that no matter how hard you worked, how loyal you were, or how many years you served, you were never quite seen as a full person. You might be described in household records as the boy or the wink. Your name might not appear at all. If you died, someone might mention it in passing: "We need another for the kitchen," but there would be no mourning, no grave marker. Just the slow march of time, swallowing your name like dust under a rug. And so the medieval world filled itself with servants not through offers, but through need. The need for labor. The need to uphold status. The need to maintain systems that benefited only the few. Servants were not hired. They were absorbed, taken in, used, forgotten. No matter how you became a servant, whether by birth, by poverty, or by misfortune, the end result was the same. You were now part of a silent army that kept castles warm, tables full, and nobles comfortable. You did not matter as a person, only as a function, only as a body that bent, scrubbed, carried, and obeyed. And when we say you wouldn't survive one day as a medieval servant, this is where it begins, not in the duties, not in the endless toil, but in the quiet theft of choice. The slow realization that your life was never really yours. That before you even knew your own name, the world had already written your obituary. It loomed over you, the day you arrived, stone upon stone piled high like a fortress and a tomb at once. Your master's house was enormous, yet every step you took inside it made you feel smaller. The manor, or if your luck was particularly poor, a castle, was not designed with you in mind. You were not meant to feel comforted by its size. You were meant to disappear into it. The higher the ceiling, the lower you felt. Everything inside whispered that it was not yours. The tapestries, imported and colorful, didn't cover the cold you felt while walking barefoot across stone floors. The chairs with carved arms were not for your back. The great fireplaces, roaring with logs you carried, were not for your warmth. You were the heat bringer, not the one warmed. You were the dust wiper, not the one who rested. You moved through the house like breath through a flute, present, essential, and utterly unnoticed. There was a servant's entrance. Always. Usually at the back or the side, narrow and unlit, with a latch that creaked no matter how many times it was oiled. You did not use the front doors. Those were reserved for lords, ladies, visitors of status, and anyone who didn't need to ask permission to enter. You were taught to bow to the front door from behind it. You belonged in the shadows and behind the curtains, where polite society need not look at you directly. The layout of the manor was known only to those who worked inside. There were servants' stairs, narrow, steep, uneven things that seemed to spiral forever. You climbed them daily, balancing trays, buckets, logs, and silence. Your footsteps had to be light, your presence barely felt. Some servants never saw the great hall, never stood under the vaulted ceilings, or looked out through the stained glass windows. Their entire world consisted of basements, cellars, kitchens, and storage. Your sleeping quarters, a low room tucked under the eaves, or a stone chamber by the hearth that you shared with 3, maybe 4 others. The air was thick with smoke, wet wool, and the scent of sore feet. You kept your belongings, if you had any, in a cloth bundle, or under your straw mat. There was no door, no privacy, no peace. Just the creak of the walls at night and the occasional whimper of someone dreaming of better days, that never came. You did not decorate your space. There were no pictures or tokens or flowers on a shelf. Why bother? This was not your home. It was your station. The house belonged to the master, and so did everything inside it, every pot, every stool, every spoon, and every minute of your time. You didn't get attached. You simply endured. The house was quiet in a loud way. Footsteps echoed endlessly. Doors groaned on their hinges. Fireplaces crackled like they were chewing on bones. And above it all, the voices of the master's family would float, distant and unreachable, like birds calling from a place you could never fly to. You heard arguments through the walls, laughter that wasn't yours, commands barked by children who had never lifted a thing in their lives. The house reminded you constantly of where you stood. And yet, you knew every inch of it. You knew which floorboard creaked, which window stuck, which bucket leaked. You knew the exact length of rope needed to hoist water from the well. You knew which rooms needed more logs in winter, which halls filled with fog at dawn, and which corners the spiders liked best. You knew these things the way your own hands knew the broom's handle. The house didn't know your name, but you knew its secrets. Still, no matter how long you lived there, 10 years, 20, even your whole life, you never called it home. That word belonged to the family upstairs. It belonged to the ones who got warm beds and served plates, and who never had to ask permission to open a door. You might spend your entire life in the same building, yet never once be allowed to sit in the front hall. Never once dine at the table you cleaned. Never once be called, one of us. Even your comings and goings were controlled. You didn't leave the manor unless sent out. And if you did, perhaps to fetch supplies, or attend mass, you returned quickly, quietly, and without being seen by those outside. To the village, you were, one of them, a house servant. To the household, you were, one of those, a tool. You belonged nowhere. And so you learned to exist in liminal space. Not quite a prisoner, but never free. Not quite family, but always present. Not quite alive in the way the noble family lived, with leisure, legacy, and love, but still breathing, still laboring, still wearing yourself away on stone floors and kitchen fires. You were the moving parts of a home that never welcomed you. You made the bed, but never laid in it. You lit the hearth, but never warmed your hands. And every time the lord of the manor walked past you without acknowledgement, every time the latest ringed fingers pointed toward a mess you hadn't made, every time a guest referred to you as the boy, or the girl, or the maid, you were reminded once again, this house was not yours. This home, this towering, echoing place of wealth and stone, was where you lived. But it was never your home. It never would be. There was no rooster. No alarm bell gently chimming you into wakefulness. No warm bed to stretch in. No sunlight drifting lazily across the room. For a medieval servant, morning did not arrive as a blessing. It arrived like a blow. A boot to your cot, a shove to your shoulder, or the barked command of an older servant, who had already been awake for hours. Before the sun crept above the horizon, your feet were already on the icy floor, your body already aching, your mind already dulled by exhaustion. Your room, or rather, your assigned sleeping space, was cold and cramped. A shared corner with bodies breathing heavily all around you, blankets thin and damp from the night's chill. You rose into darkness, guided not by light but by habit. Your first task was not to clean yourself, or wash your face. No. There wasn't time. Your first task was to get moving, because if you moved too slowly, someone would notice. And that never ended well. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp stone. You dressed quickly, in yesterday's tunic, still dirty from the soot and sweat of the day before. No one had spare clothes. No one had fresh linens. You didn't even have shoes if you were young or poor enough. You tied on whatever you could, tugged a rough wool over your shoulders if it was winter, and crept into the hallways, silent as a shadow. There was no breakfast. Not for you. Food was a distant luxury reserved for the family above and perhaps the steward, if he was in a generous mood. Your hunger was a companion, gnawing at you gently as you scrubbed the floors, or fetched water from the well. Sometimes you'd chew a piece of stale bread, tucked secretly into your sleeve from the night before, but only if you were lucky enough to have it, and only if no one else saw. Your duties began immediately. The fires had to be lit in every hearth before the family stirred. That meant carrying logs and kindling through cold stone corridors, your fingers stiff and red from the morning chill. You learned quickly how to start a fire without smoke, because if you filled the room with soot or set off the wrong smell, you'd be blamed and beaten. There were no second chances. Just second scoldings. Water had to be drawn from the well, buckets and buckets of it, heavy and sloshing against your legs. You needed it for the wash basins, the cooking, the animals, and the cleaning. You climbed stairs with full buckets, slipped on icy steps, bruised your shins, bit your tongue, and kept going. Because if you didn't, someone else would, and you'd lose even the small favor you'd earned in your short, tired life. The kitchen was chaos. Coals needed fanning, pots needed scrubbing, bread needed baking. All of it had to be done hours before the family awoke so that their table would be warm and waiting, filled with meat and honey and milk and eggs you would never taste. The cook shouted orders while slapping your hands for moving too slowly. You worked elbow to elbow with other servants, everyone pretending not to mind the hunger curling in their bellies. If you were a chambermaid, you rushed upstairs with linens in hand, hoping to reach the bedrooms before the noble family stirred. You made beds you'd never sleep in. You aired garments you weren't allowed to touch without gloves. If the latest dog had soiled the carpet again, you cleaned it without complaint, face turned away from the stench, knees on the freezing stone floor. You were the quiet ghost, who passed through their private rooms. Heard but not heard. Seen only if there was something to punish. The stable boys were already at work too, brushing down horses that had stomped through their hay all night. Muck had to be shoveled, tack polished, grain fetched. If a hoof was cracked or a saddle left damp, the wrath would fall hard. You learned to fear not the horse, but the knight who owned it. Your day started with manure and ended with bruises, and somewhere in between, you hoped no one remembered your name. Still, you were expected to look alert. Eyes forward. Shoulders back. The Lord did not want to see a servant yawning in the corner or leaning on a broom. Idleness was an offense. Even if your stomach churned, your muscles ached, and your head throbbed from too little sleep, you stood ready. Ready for more orders. Ready to say, "Yes, my lord," and "Yes, my lady," until your throat went dry. And still, no food. Still no rest. Still the long stretch of morning unraveling into the day ahead, full of tasks and stares and accidents waiting to be punished. You could not sit. You could not stop. You could not speak unless spoken to. You worked as the sun rose, but you did not get to enjoy its warmth. You were the unseen hand behind every candle lit, every basin filled, every crumb placed delicately on a noble's plate. This was how every day began. In silence, in cold, in hunger, in motion. And it would begin this way again tomorrow. And the day after that. And the day after that. The work never stopped. There was no finish line, no checklist that brought relief, no moment when someone said, "Good job, you can rest now." To be a servant was to be in motion from the moment your eyes opened until the hour they closed, and even then, you often dreamed of more work. The jobs weren't hard in the way people today understand hard. They were hard in the way that broke down your back, your skin, your pride, and eventually, your very sense of self. You scrubbed floors. Not with soft brushes and lemon-scented soap, but with rags and ashes, on your knees, for hours. You did this daily because nobles liked to see their reflections on the stone. The dirt always returned, tracked in by Boots or the family's dogs or the very people who scolded you for the grime. But you kept scrubbing. Over and over. Because that's what you were told to do. You carried water. Buckets and buckets of it. From wells, streams, rain barrels, wherever it could be found. You carried it upstairs, across courtyards, into kitchens, into basins, into bedrooms. Some houses had no indoor plumbing, so the water had to be warmed over fire and brought by hand. If a noble wanted a bath, it took dozens of trips to fill the tub. And you weren't done when the tub was full. You had to fetch towels, light more fires, clean up the mess afterward. You emptied chamber pots. The euphemism is night soil. The reality is worse. You collected the household's waste in ceramic pots, sometimes with cracked handles and overflowing lids, and carried it down narrow, slippery stairs to dump in cesspits or designated corners of the yard. It sloshed. It smelled. It sometimes spilled. No one thanked you. They just expected it to disappear. You tended fires. Dozens of them. Hearths in bedrooms, in kitchens, in gathering rooms, in halls. If a fire went out in the wrong room, the entire house could grow cold, and you would get the blame. So you watched the embers constantly, hauling logs through halls, stacking wood, poking ash, sweeping soot, all day long. Your fingernails were always black. Your arms always sore. Your back permanently bent. If you worked in the kitchen, you never stopped moving. You cleaned the spit boys' tools, turned roasts, stirred porridge, plucked chickens, sorted beans from stones, chopped herbs with dull blades, and tried not to slice your fingers while rushing. The cook was usually angry and loud, especially if something burned or boiled over. You learned to dodge thrown spoons and angry elbows. The kitchen was hotter than the fires it fed. And you sweated all day, with no cool drink or rest. If you worked in laundry, the job was worse. You soaked linens in caustic solutions made from ashes and lye. You beat them against rocks or washboards. You wrung them dry with burning hands, then carried them out into the wind to dry. Clothes were heavy when wet, and drying racks tall. Your arms itched. Your knuckles bled. You could never quite wash the stink from your own skin. Laundry was endless: sheets, tunics, undercloths, cloaks, towels, curtains, more and more and more. There were also the animals. Chickens that pecked you, goats that kicked, pigs that ran wild, cows that needed milking, dogs that dirtied rugs. You fed them all, cleaned up after them, repaired their pens. Sometimes a sick animal died in the night, and you had to drag its body out by yourself. The stench stuck in your clothes for days. The master never saw that part. Only the roast on his table. And if you were assigned to serve the noble family directly, that was its own kind of burden. You fetched slippers, poured wine, held trays, buttoned gowns, combed hair, tied corsets, mended tears. You stood in corners for hours, waiting in silence. You answered bells even when you were already half asleep. You pretended not to notice when a lord spoke cruelly, or when a lady sobbed, or when something broke that you would be blamed for. You became invisible on purpose. None of the work was interesting. It was not fulfilling. It was not creative. It was repetitive, bone-deep, blister-making drudgery. And the moment you finished one task, another waited. Clean the steps. Scrub the boots. Gather herbs. Catch the loose dog. Sharpen the knives. Stitch the hem. Sweep the ashes. You were never done. Not even for a breath. And through all of it, no one said thank you. No one paused to ask how you were. The better you did your job, the less you were noticed. The goal was not excellence. The goal was invisibility. Because when you were invisible, you were not in trouble. Because trouble came with raised voices, with thrown objects, with lost meals, with bruises that no one asked about. The hours passed, but the work did not. You worked when sick. You worked while bleeding. You worked while hungry, while cold, while dizzy with heat. You worked because there was no other option. The jobs were endless. The tasks filthy. the cycle unbroken. And still the bell would ring again. And you would answer it. In the rigid hierarchy of a medieval household, a servant's margin for error was thinner than the edge of a blade. There were no gentle warnings, no whispered corrections, no second chances. You weren't given the grace to learn through failure. You were expected to know. And if you didn't, if you slipped, stumbled, or forgot, then the consequences came quickly, and they came hard. In a noble's home, mistakes weren't inconvenient. They were insulting. And that made them punishable. You could ruin your day with a single drop. Spill a goblet of wine on the Lord's tablecloth, and you'd find yourself on your knees, scrubbing with vinegar while the room filled with whispers. Knock over a candlestick and suddenly the manor's firewood ration might be spent on repairing the floor. And if the wax reached the tapestry, you'd better hope someone took pity on you, because damage to the family's property wasn't just a mistake, it was treated as sabotage. Even if your hands were cold, your fingers numb, and the floor slick with soot, none of that mattered. Excuses were not accepted from those at the bottom. Speech could destroy you just as swiftly as clumsiness. You were expected to speak only when spoken to, and even then, the wrong tone could land you in trouble. Forget to call someone, my lord, or, my lady, and your manners would be questioned. Say too much, and you might be accused of insolence. Say too little, and you might be called slow or lazy. If a noble asked you a question and you hesitated, your silence could be taken for disrespect. And if you answered truthfully, but in a way that displeased them, you might be branded a liar, or worse, a troublemaker. It wasn't just what you said. It was how you stood. Where your eyes looked. How quickly you moved to obey. Walk too fast, and you were disruptive. Walk too slowly, and you were sluggish. If your head was too low, you seemed shifty. If your chin was too high, you were getting ideas. A servant existed in a carefully policed posture of obedience, just noticeable enough to serve, just invisible enough to avoid rebuke. Stray from that balance, even slightly, and someone would notice. Someone always noticed. Mistakes were contagious, too. If one servant made an error, others often shared the blame. You could be punished for being in the same room, for not stopping something fast enough, for not reporting it, though if you did report it, you might be labeled a tattler and alienated from the only people who ever looked out for you. It was a constant gamble, protect yourself or protect others. There was no right answer, just a slow rotation of fear, silence, and regret. The punishments were never subtle. A smack across the face, a strike with a rod or wooden spoon, a shove into a wall. Some were made to kneel for hours on cold stone as others walked past. Some were denied food. Some were locked in storerooms, forgotten for hours, or made to sleep outside with the animals. The worst punishments were public, because humiliation, for a servant, was as good as a rasher. It marked you. It followed you. Even the smallest tasks became tests. Pour the wine too slowly, and you were called clumsy. Pour it too quickly, and you were impatient. Serve the wrong dish to the wrong person, and the entire table would stop to glare. Forget to curtsy at the right moment, and someone might throw a spoon. The pressure built slowly but constantly. Every movement you made, every breath you took was watched by someone who had the power to make you suffer for a moment of imperfection. There were no safe days. Even on holy days or feast days or birthdays, a mistake could bring everything crashing down. In fact, those days were worse. More guests, more food, more cleaning, more expectation. A dropped platter during a banquet could get you dismissed without warning. And dismissal wasn't just losing a job. It meant losing shelter. It meant being thrown into the cold, into hunger, into shame. Dismissal wasn't the only end. For those in more remote or less regulated houses, punishment could be worse. Beatings that left bruises for weeks. A broken rib. A scar. And still, you returned to work. Because you had no choice. Because the world outside had even less mercy. And it wasn't only your mistakes that mattered. You might be punished for things that had nothing to do with you at all. For another servant's error. For a noble's bad mood. For a broken dish that was already cracked. For a change in weather, or a rumor, or a dream someone had that morning. You learned that justice was not part of your world. There were rules, but they were written in air. And punishment fell like rain, hitting wherever it pleased. In time, you began to flinch before anything happened. You apologized before you knew what for. You started to move more carefully, speak more quietly, breathe more shallowly. You lived in fear of breaking something, saying something, being seen. Your body ached not just from work, but from constant anticipation of punishment. And worst of all, you began to blame yourself. Even when the lash wasn't fair. Even when the scolding wasn't true. Because you knew, deep down, that no one would take your side. There were no appeals. No hearings. No one to ask, did they really deserve that? You were a servant. And mistakes, any mistakes, were yours to suffer. The smell was everywhere. It wafted through the hallways, curled into the wooden beams, clung to the linen curtains, and followed you as you worked. Roasting meat, bubbling stew, hot bread split open to steam against cold air. It wasn't meant for you, of course. It was a cruel perfume, an invisible reminder of everything you would prepare, but never taste. In a medieval household, the food was a performance. And you were not in the audience. You were the stagehand. Servants did not sit at tables covered with white cloth. They did not dip fingers into sauces or tear crusty bread beside candlelight. You carried the food, steaming and perfect from the kitchens to the noble's hall. You served dishes with names you never learned to pronounce: pheasant, trout, pottage thick with butter, pies wrapped in golden crusts. You held the trays carefully, knowing one wobble could cost you not just the meal, but your job. And then, once the food was laid out, once the lords and ladies had filled their plates, you waited silently, back against the wall, your own stomach curling in on itself. You rarely ate before sunrise. There was no time. Your mornings were for lighting fires, fetching water, and preparing breakfast for someone else. The noble family would be served first, always, and with careful ceremony. If any scraps were left, and if the steward permitted it, you might have a crust or two, in the mid-morning. Not in the great hall. Not on plates. But perhaps in the kitchen, standing, with one hand still stirring a pot or polishing pewter. The food you did get was humble. Gruel, mostly. Thin barley porridge, sometimes salted if there was extra. Bread that had gone hard, soaked in broth to soften. Turnips boiled until their taste disappeared. If the household had cheese, it was old, rind thick and sour. If you were lucky, you might have a bite of onion or a piece of fruit too bruised to serve upstairs. And you ate quickly, because the bell might ring again. Because there was always another command, another fire to stoke, another bucket to carry. There were feast days, of course. Special occasions when the household would bring in even more food, more servants, more chaos. Pies shaped like birds. Fish molded into sculptures. Sweets soaked in honey. The smells on those days were unbearable. You could barely concentrate. You served guests while your stomach growled so loudly it echoed in your chest. And when it was all over, when the nobles retired to their private chambers, and the hall finally emptied, you were allowed to eat, if anything remained. Usually bones. The rind of a pie. Crumbs brushed from the table. Sometimes you saw food hit the floor, perfect, and eaten, and ruined. A roasted capon that fell from a plate. A wine-soaked fig dropped and forgotten. Your instinct was to grab it. To hide it in your apron, to sneak it behind a curtain. But you didn't. Because if you were caught, the punishment would be swift. Stealing food, no matter how small, no matter how discarded, was a crime in many houses. A servant could be dismissed or beaten for so much as licking grease from their fingers. Hunger became a constant companion. You learned to ignore it, the way you ignored the cold in winter or the blisters on your feet. It was always there, pressing into your ribs, turning in your gut like a slow knife. It didn't rage anymore. It whispered. It waited. There was never enough food to feel full. Only enough to feel not quite empty. You might think servants grew used to the hunger. But no one really does. It eats at your patience, your clarity, your strength. You lift slower. You forget more. You shake when no one's looking. And you carry the scent of roast duck and fresh bread through your dreams. Not because you remember how it tastes, but because you never knew. There were whispers among servants. Tricks, they said. Eat dry oats with water, it swells in your belly. Drink hot broth slowly, it tricks your body into feeling full. Chew dried herbs, it curbs the edge. Some swore by boiled cabbage water. Others fasted all day to earn a sliver of meat in the evening. It didn't work. You still felt it. In your bones. In your sleep. And still, the food passed before you. Trays glittering with fat. Platters decorated with oranges, cloves, and rosemary. You carried them like treasure, but never touched them. You saw nobles throw them away, half-eaten, because the flavor was too bland, or too spicy, or too warm. And you swallowed your frustration like everything else. Quietly. Because anger could not feed you. And so each day passed in hunger. And each day repeated. You cooked. You served. You cleaned. You smelled the roast, the butter, the spices. And you dreamed of meals that never arrived. Time, for a medieval servant, did not belong to the sun. It did not belong to the seasons. It did not belong to the sky or the stars, or the long hush of evening wind over the fields. Your time belonged to the bell. The bell decided everything. When to wake. When to walk. When to serve, to carry, to light, to clean, to stop, to kneel, to move again. The bell was not simply a sound, it was a master of its own. It rang in the dark hours before sunrise, when your eyes still struggled to stay open. It rang to call you to duties you were already performing. It rang before meals, meals not for you, and again after, when the great hall had to be cleared. It rang when the master awoke. When the lady wanted her hair combed. When the horses were to be saddled. When the children needed minding. When something had been dropped. Forgotten. Broken. You could not hide from it. The bell echoed through stone halls, through wooden beams, through plastered walls and sleep-deprived dreams. Its sound was not loud, but it was sharp, intrusive, a command wrapped in iron. You never asked, "Why is it ringing?" You simply went. Because every moment you waited was a moment someone noticed your absence. Every second between bell and obedience was another mark against you. There was no privacy. Not in the kitchen, not in the stables, not in the servants' quarters, not even in the garden. You shared your space with others, elbow to elbow, back to back. You whispered when you could. You laughed only when no one important was near. You changed your clothes behind half-hinged doors, or under your blanket while others pretended not to look. You had no room to stretch out, no door to close. Your time and your body were not yours. They were borrowed. And always expected to be returned to service. If you ever paused, just for a moment, just to breathe, it felt dangerous. Even leaning against a wall to catch your breath could be seen as idleness. Resting your head on your arms for a moment's sleep might get you cuffed across the ear. Every movement had to be purposeful. Even your silence had to be useful. You could not sit by the fire unless you were turning the spit. You could not pause in the hallway unless you were waiting with a pitcher or a towel. To stop was to be seen. And to be seen doing nothing was never forgiven. The moments of solitude, if they came at all, were stolen. A few breaths in the privy. A slow walk to the well if no one was watching. A second to stare out a window while pretending to wipe it. Those tiny fragments were precious beyond words. Not because they were peaceful, but because they reminded you that you still existed beneath the uniform. Beneath the apron. Beneath the orders and bows and curtsies and yes, my lords. You were still a person. Somewhere. But the bell always rang again. It interrupted everything. Thoughts. Memories. Dreams. It reminded you of your place. You weren't there to think. You were there to serve. Some days, the bell rang before you'd even stood up. Other days, it rang so many times you lost count. Its sound followed you into your sleep, where you'd wake in the night, heart racing, certain you had missed something. But it was just your mind, echoing the sound of duty. Even in rest, you were still on call. You didn't own hours. You didn't own minutes. Time didn't belong to you. It belonged to the bell, and to the people who rang it. You were only passing through it, moving from one task to another, always under the weight of obligation, until you forgot what it meant to be still. And still, each day, you returned to the same work, the same halls, the same bell. Your life measured not by choices or memories, but by the intervals between someone else's needs. And so the hours slipped away, quietly, without yours to keep. You couldn't afford to get sick. Not really. In the life of a medieval servant, illness wasn't seen as misfortune, it was seen as inconvenience. Not for you, but for the household. You were a cog in a wheel, a set of hands, that needed to be ready and moving, not curled up with fever or shaking from chills. If you slowed down, the entire rhythm of the manor stumbled, and no one appreciated that. Your body didn't belong to you. Not even in sickness. There was no such thing as a sick day. If your limbs ached and your throat burned, you still had to carry water, light fires, serve meals, sweep ash, and polish boots. If you coughed, you were told to do it quietly. If you limped, you were told to move faster. Any sign of weakness was met not with concern, but with frustration. The other servants couldn't pick up your slack, they already had too much of their own. And the nobles certainly wouldn't. They barely noticed you were unwell. Unless, of course, you got worse. The line between mild illness and life-threatening disease was razor thin. A fever might pass in a day, or turn into pneumonia. A scratch might heal, or fester into something deadly. A cough might just be dust, or the beginning of something much worse. And still, you worked. Because the alternative, lying down, resting, asking for help, wasn't available. You didn't dare slow down. Because falling behind was a kind of betrayal. And betrayal, in the eyes of the master, needed punishment. Sometimes, illness made you clumsy. The bowl you dropped wasn't because you were careless, it was because your arms wouldn't stop trembling. The bed you forgot to make wasn't out of laziness, it was because you couldn't remember what day it was. But no one asked why. No one cared. All they saw was the mistake. And the bell would ring again. And you'd be called forward to answer for it. Not with words, but with silence. With a lowered gaze. With a slap. With hours added to an already impossible day. There were herbs, sometimes. Old remedies passed between servants and whispers. Willow bark for fever. Onion poultices for coughs. Vinegar compresses for infection. But they weren't cures. Just attempts to soften the edges of pain long enough to keep moving. Some swore by tying garlic around the neck. Others sipped weak beer or chewed on fennel. It helped a little. Sometimes. But the real remedy, rest, was never on offer. Infections spread easily. You shared quarters, beds, linens, cups. One sick servant meant 10 more within days. Coughing at night, sweating in the mornings, hiding rashes beneath sleeves and discoloration beneath scarves. No one wanted to be seen as the source. So no one spoke of it. You worked through it. Until your legs gave out. Until you collapsed. And even then, the first reaction wasn't help, it was irritation. You had interrupted the schedule. If you were lucky, you were allowed to lie on a straw mat in the corner. Maybe someone brought broth. Maybe someone whispered a prayer. But work didn't stop. Buckets still needed carrying. Ashes still needed cleaning. If you didn't recover quickly, your job might be given to someone else. And you would find yourself outside the manor walls, dizzy, weak, and unwanted. The worst illnesses, the ones that made you burn with fever, tremble with cold, cough blood into your sleeve, were met with fear, not compassion. Nobles didn't want contagion in their walls. If they suspected plague or something worse, you were sent away. Not to a healer, just away. To die quietly, far from the estate. Your absence might be noted with a shrug. She was unwell, they'd say. He grew too slow. Then another servant would take your place. And the work would go on. You dreamed of rest. Not comfort. Not healing. Just rest. A night without coughing. A day without sweating through your tunic. A moment without your bones aching from the inside out. But that rest never came. Because the work didn't wait. And neither did the punishment. If you slowed, you were warned. If you stumbled, you were scolded. And if you failed to rise, you disappeared. And the bell kept ringing. For someone else now. As if you had never been there at all. Sleep wasn't a right. It wasn't even a reward. In the life of a medieval servant, sleep was something you stole. Not claimed, not scheduled, but taken when no one was looking. And even then, it was shallow, restless, and often interrupted by bells, barking, footsteps, or voices in the next room. You didn't sleep because it was night. You slept because there was finally nothing else to do for the next 10 minutes. Maybe 15, if you were lucky. The day began long before the sun. Most servants were up before the cocks crowed, when the air still had the sharp edge of midnight. You lit fires in the dark, hauled water through the fog, shivered in layers of wool that barely held the chill out. You didn't begin the day with a stretch or a yawn, you began it already exhausted. Because the night before, sleep had not come easily. Or fully. Or long enough. Servants didn't sleep in private rooms. You shared narrow straw mattresses with others, shoulder to shoulder, foot to foot. Sometimes it was two to a bed. Sometimes more. Blankets were shared. Body heat was necessary. And snoring, coughing, shifting, and murmuring were all part of the nightly chorus. The space was cramped, poorly ventilated, and often filled with the lingering scent of smoke, sweat, and damp wool. If someone had fleas, you probably did too by morning. There were no bedtime rituals. No winding down. You collapsed into bed when the last task was done, when the last bell had rung, and not a second before. Sometimes your hands still smelled of onion or ash. Sometimes your shoes were still on. You fell asleep not out of comfort but out of defeat. And your sleep wasn't deep. It was light, shallow, and always haunted by the fear of being called again. And many nights, you were called, that is. A guest arrived late. A noble wanted warm wine. A child had nightmares and needed comfort. You'd be shaken awake, blinking, barely aware, your body heavy with exhaustion but forced into movement once again. You learned to rise quickly. To function half asleep. Because stumbling or being slow in the middle of the night could bring the same consequences as in the day. Punishment did not respect the hour. And when you returned to your straw mattress, if you did at all, the space was colder. The others had shifted. Your warmth was gone. You curled in tighter, shivering, muscles aching, head heavy but thoughts still racing. Would the bell ring again? Had you forgotten anything? Would someone scold you in the morning for something you missed tonight? The dark didn't answer. It only pressed down heavier. Some servants tried to nap during the day, if time allowed. A stolen moment behind the stable, or a quiet lull in the scullery. But even then, rest was dangerous. If you were found dozing, you'd be accused of sloth. And sloth, in the medieval world, wasn't just laziness, it was a moral failing. A sin. A sign that you were unworthy of your position, ungrateful for your bread, disloyal to the household. You learned to live in fatigue. To operate through it. To let it live in your bones without resisting. Your eyes burned. Your back ached. Your fingers trembled. And still, you worked. Because the alternative, refusing, resting, asking for more sleep, was unthinkable. Over time, sleep became something you forgot how to crave. It was like warmth. Like comfort. a luxury reserved for those above you. Nobles had feather beds, curtains to close, chambers with fires. You had straw, and a few hours, if no one called. If the bell stayed silent, if nothing caught fire, if no child cried, if no dish was forgotten, and the sleep you got, it wasn't restful. It was filled with dreams of work, carrying buckets, relighting fires, scrubbing floors that never stayed clean. You dreamed of bells. And when you woke, you sometimes weren't sure if you were still asleep. The work never stopped, not even in your mind. So no, sleep was not something a medieval servant truly knew. Not the deep, nourishing sleep of peace or security. You survived on scraps of it, like you survived on scraps of food. You lived in a world where rest was rationed. And dreaming, if it came at all, was just another job your body performed while waiting for the next task. Tears meant nothing. You could cry if you wanted, but don't expect anyone to stop and ask why. In the world of medieval service, emotions were silent passengers, uninvited and unwelcome. There was no time for sorrow, no place for pain, and no sympathy for the weight you carried. If your eyes welled up while scrubbing the stone floor, you simply blinked and kept scrubbing. No one would kneel beside you. No one would ask what was wrong. Pain was assumed. It was part of the job. Your back ached. That meant you were working hard. Your feet blistered. That meant you were doing your duty. You missed your family, your home, your old life. That meant you were weak. There was no time to be soft in a world so hard. You could not carry trays and tears at the same time. If you cried during your tasks, someone might notice, but not in the way you hoped. They might frown, or sneer, or mutter that you were being dramatic. There's work to be done, they'd say. Tears won't scrub the floors. And they were right. Your sorrow had no function. It solved nothing. It fed no one. It only slowed you down. The older servants didn't cry. Or at least not where anyone could see. They moved through each day with practiced indifference. Blank faces. Quiet eyes. Their silence wasn't cold, it was self-preservation. They had learned that emotions made you vulnerable. That feelings were liabilities. That kindness, once shown, might be punished if it interfered with the schedule. So they trained their hearts to stay quiet. You learned to do the same. To tuck your feelings away, like spare buttons or scraps of cloth. Stored, forgotten, sometimes lost entirely. If you missed someone, you remembered them in fragments, only in the seconds before sleep, or while peeling turnips. If something hurt, you swallowed it like stale bread. You kept going. Because you had to. Grief? That was the hardest. If a family member died back home, the news might reach you weeks later, if at all. And even then, you were expected to keep working. No morning clothes. No time off. Just another day in the scullery or the stables, with loss trapped inside your chest like smoke behind stone. Sometimes the younger servants wept quietly at night, when they thought no one could hear. Curled on straw mats, faces turned to the wall, breaths hitched in silence. No one comforted them. Not out of cruelty, but because they had no comfort to give. Kindness cost time. Time cost favor. And favor was the only thing that kept you from falling even further. You became skilled at pretending. At nodding when you wanted to scream. At bowing when you wanted to disappear. At smiling faintly when your insides felt scraped raw. You became two people, the one they saw, and the one who lived just beneath your skin, waiting for a moment of quiet that never came. And yet sometimes, something would break through. A song hummed softly in the kitchens. A small gift passed in secret, a crust of bread, a smoother blanket. A glance from another servant that said, "I see you, I know." You didn't speak of it. You just kept going. But in those moments, the wall of silence cracked just slightly. Still, no one ever told you it was okay to cry. And so, eventually, you stopped. Not because the pain was gone, But because the world you lived in had no room for it, the tears dried, the feelings dulled. You didn't stop feeling because you were strong. You stopped because you couldn't afford to feel anymore. No matter how early you rose, no matter how fast your hands moved, how steady your feet were, how well you memorized the master's routine, you were always replaceable. That knowledge sat in your chest like cold iron. Not always sharp, not always urgent, but constant. A quiet presence, like a shadow following your every step. One mistake could cost you everything. And sometimes, it didn't even take a mistake. The world outside the manor walls was full of people willing to take your place. Desperate for food, for shelter, for warmth by a fire that wasn't their own. There was always someone hungrier, someone younger, someone with stronger arms or a quieter mouth. The manor did not need you. It needed a servant. Any servant. You were just filling the space for now. You could be dismissed for anything. A cracked plate. A forgotten message. A whispered rumor about your attitude. A minor illness that made you slow for too long. A noble's passing whim. One moment you were part of the machine. The next, you were standing at the gates with your bundle, your name already fading from memory. This fear was never spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. You saw it in the eyes of other servants. The way they flinched when called by name. The way they straightened their backs when the steward passed. The way they never argued. Even when the task was unfair. Even when they were too tired to stand. Because the smallest protest could be seen as rebellion. And rebellion, in this world, didn't end with speeches. It ended with silence. There were no second chances. If you were sent away, you didn't go with a reference or kind words. You went with nothing. Just your clothes, your aching feet, and the knowledge that you had been useful, until you weren't. You might find another post. But the same fear would follow you there too. The same need to please. The same pressure to vanish your identity, and become exactly what was needed, without hesitation. It shaped how you spoke. You didn't joke too much. You didn't complain. You never criticized anyone above you, even in whispers. Your personality was something folded away, like a garment worn only in private, if ever. You became a reflection of what was wanted, expected, acceptable. You performed every day, and the performance never ended. And there were always reminders. When a servant was dismissed, there were no farewells. No moments to pack slowly or say goodbye. Sometimes they simply vanished overnight. You'd wake in the morning and see their bed empty, their belongings gone. No one explained. No one asked. Because asking was dangerous. Curiosity could make you next. Even if you worked without flaw, you were still at risk. Maybe a noble's child disliked your face. Maybe you served wine too slowly at supper. Maybe the steward wanted to cut costs. You lived in constant awareness that your place in the house was not guaranteed. Not for a day. Not for an hour. You had to earn it again every time you woke. And so, fear became your companion. You didn't show it. You didn't speak of it. But it lived in you. It shaped your every breath, every bow, every careful step on flagstone floors. It crept into your sleep, and made your rest shallow. It told you that no matter how well you served, someone better might be waiting just outside the door. And that was the truth of it. You were not special. You were not secure. You were not needed, only useful. Until you weren't. There's a quiet kind of breaking. Not loud. Not violent. Not something that ends with shouting, or slamming doors. It doesn't even look like breaking. It looks like standing up too slowly. Like forgetting a name you've said every day for years. Like pouring wine and watching the cup overflow, and just not stopping. That's the kind of breaking that happens to servants. The kind that builds, quietly, over months of being unseen, unheard, and always tired. It starts with small slips. You forget the third spoon at the noble's table. You miss a patch of soot on the hearth. You tie your apron a little looser. You stop responding with, "Yes, my lord," as quickly. The others notice, but they don't say much. Not because they don't care, because they're watching their own edges. Everyone's always on the verge of something. A yawn held in too long. A wince kept behind the eyes. Then there's the moment. The snap. But not like a twig in a storm. More like thread unraveling. Maybe someone drops their goblet, and you don't move to clean it up right away. Maybe the master yells and you don't flinch. Maybe you hear the bell, and you don't move. You hear it, but you sit still, staring at your hands. You wonder when they got so old. So cracked. So quiet. No one notices. They think you're just slow today. Maybe tired. Maybe lazy. Maybe not trying hard enough. No one looks close enough to see that something inside you has stopped ticking. That the clockwork has rusted. That you're not just slow, you're broken. And worse, you don't even care that you are. You walk through the motions anyway. Out of habit. Out of muscle memory. You place dishes, sweep ash, nod and curtsy, but none of it means anything. Your thoughts float somewhere else. Not dreaming, just drifting. You're still there, but not really. You stopped being a person a long time ago. Now you're a shape in the hallway. A pair of hands that move. Some days, you don't speak at all. You realize, just before sleep, that not a single word passed your lips. And no one noticed. You begin to wonder if you even exist when no one's looking. You try to catch your reflection in the water bucket just to remind yourself. But even that looks like a stranger. You don't cry. You don't scream. You just fade. A little more each day. Until you are only the job. Only the tasks. Only the routine. And no one asks where you went. Because the work is still being done. So everything must be fine. Eventually, the steward calls your name, and you don't answer right away. Not out of defiance. Just because it doesn't sound familiar anymore. The name is a thing that belonged to someone with hope. Someone who cared. Someone who thought this was temporary. But you've been here too long. You don't remember who that person was. The moment passes. You nod. You obey. You carry the tray. You clean the floor. The bell rings. You move. But inside, nothing moves anymore. And still, no one notices. There were no weekends. No holidays. No days when the manor let its shoulders drop, and said, "Rest." Every morning began the same. The same bell. The same cold air. The same damp boots and aching muscles. You woke before the sun because sleep, like everything else, was rationed. Not granted, permitted. And just enough to keep you moving. You folded into the day without resistance. Not because you were eager, but because you had stopped hoping it would change. Hope was for people who had choices. You had a list of tasks that repeated every sunrise like a hymn. The hearth had to be swept. The floor scrubbed. The chamber pots emptied. The firewood stacked. The soup stirred. Always the same. It didn't matter if it rained or froze, or you felt something sharp behind your eyes. The manor didn't pause. And neither could you. The cycle blurred everything. You lost the names of days. Was it Wednesday? Did that even matter? Time wasn't measured in dates but in duties. How many fires had you lit this week? How many linens scrubbed raw on the washboard? How many times had you walked the same hallway and not looked up? Each step was part of a dance no one taught you, but you learned anyway. Over and over. Sometimes you imagined it was still yesterday. Because yesterday looked like today. And today would look like tomorrow. The only things that changed were faces, and even those began to blur. One cook replaced another. A stable boy was gone, another in his place. You wondered sometimes if you'd already disappeared, and no one told you. You were still moving, still present, but it felt like watching someone else through a window. The work never rewarded you. No matter how perfectly folded the linens, no matter how quickly the floor was swept. No one clapped. No one praised. It was only noticed if you failed. If a corner was missed, if ash remained, if the soup lacked salt. Mistakes were loud. Perfection was silent. So you learned to fear noise and crave nothing. Even your dreams repeated. Not the grand kind, with symbols and flying and wonder, but the dull ones. Dreaming of wiping tables. Dreaming of spilling a pail and waking in a panic. Dreaming of the bell and waking just before it rang, already half-dressed. There was no escape, not even in your mind. The cycle followed you there too. You marked the seasons by chores. Not by festivals or warmth. In winter, the water pails froze before dawn. In spring, mud tracked endlessly across floors you had just scrubbed. In summer, the laundry dried faster, but so did your skin. In autumn, leaves clogged gutters and you climbed onto slippery roofs with shaking hands. The rhythm shifted, but never stopped. And neither did you. Some tried to count time. To carve marks on the wall above their sleeping straw. But eventually, even those stopped. Because what were you counting toward? Nothing was waiting. No release. No reward. You didn't serve for a term. You served until someone replaced you, or until your body gave out. And still, each morning, the bell rang. And you rose. And the floor was cold. And your hands atched. And your name was called. And you moved. Just like yesterday. Just like tomorrow. Just like forever. Because in this life, survival wasn't measured in days lived. It was measured in how well you endured the same day over and over again. You thought about running. Of course you did. There were moments, standing knee-deep in cold laundry water, or scraping burnt oats from a pot for the fourth time that day, when the idea brushed past you, like a gust of wind. What if you just left? What if you slipped out at dusk, walked into the woods, and didn't stop? What would happen then? Would they miss you? Would they even notice you were gone? Would it matter? But you never did. Not really. You stayed. Because the idea of running, as thrilling as it was in theory, was terrifying in reality. The world outside the manor walls wasn't welcoming. It was wild. Dangerous. You had no money. No horse. No real name that mattered outside the estate. You were known here, barely. Out there, you were nothing. Worse than nothing, you were a runaway. And what would you eat? Where would you sleep? The forest was full of stories, wolves, thieves, worse. Towns were suspicious of strangers. If you had no proof of service, no ties, you could be thrown out or pressed into worse labor. Or jailed. Or worse, sold. So you stayed. Not because the manor was kind, but because it was known. And even here, there were moments, small, flickering things, that kept you tethered. A warm crust of bread pressed into your palm by the cook when no one was looking. A joke whispered in the hallway that made you smile before you remembered not to. A night when the fire stayed lit, and your toes stopped aching just long enough to believe you might survive another morning. Sometimes you even felt proud. Not of your title, or your station, or the way you were treated. But of the quiet skill you carried. How fast your hands moved. How much you could carry. How you could move through the manor without making a sound, memorizing the moods of a dozen nobles by the way they sat down to dinner. It was survival turned into art. And it mattered, even if no one said it did. Then there were the others, the servants around you. They were tired too. But they understood. They saw you in ways the nobility never did. A look across the scullery that said, I know. A shared piece of stolen cheese. A whispered prayer. You weren't alone. Not really. And sometimes that was enough. You stayed because leaving felt like vanishing. And even in pain, even in exhaustion, you still wanted to exist. You still wanted to matter, even in the smallest way. The work was endless. The pressure unbearable. But at least here, someone called your name, even if it was to tell you what you did wrong. That meant something. And so you stayed. Because staying was safer than running. Because the manor, for all its cruelty, offered certainty. Because there were no soft landings outside these walls, only cliffs. And because, deep down, you believed that maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe tomorrow someone would notice the work. Maybe the food would taste better. Maybe you would sleep a little longer. It never happened. But hope is strange that way. Even when you know better, it follows you like a shadow. So you kept going. A single day. That's all it took to understand. Just one full rotation of the sun and moon while serving in a great house, and you would feel like you had aged years. The hours didn't tick by. They pressed down. Heavy. Relentless. Every breath between tasks was stolen, not given. Every moment was accounted for, spoken for, wrung out and used. It wasn't just the labor. Though the labor alone could undo you. Hauling water. Scrubbing stone. Cooking for dozens. Cleaning filth with frozen fingers. It wasn't even the pain, though the pain became your constant companion, knees, back, hands, all stiff and swollen from repetition. What truly wore you down was the unending presence. You had to be there. Always. Alert. Quiet. Ready? Never seen until you were needed, and then completely visible, completely responsible. There was no mental rest. You could never think about yourself, your dreams, your body, your history. You didn't belong to yourself for that day. You were the property of duty. Every smile was forced. Every error punished. And the strange, cruel part was that this wasn't considered harsh. This was just normal. Expected. Ordinary. By the time the sun dipped below the edge of the manor, your body ached in places you had no names for. Your hands trembled. Your eyelids stung. But still there were shoes to scrub. Still trays to clean. Still water to haul. And still, above all, you were expected to keep moving. Quietly. Gratefully. Because one day of survival was a privilege. To serve was to be lucky, they said. At least you were not starving in a ditch. But one day was enough to break you. Enough to teach you that endurance was the only thing a servant truly owned. Not your time. Not your rest. Not even your body. Just your ability to keep going. To keep lifting. To keep quiet. To keep serving. It was not a skill, it was a condition. And when, at last, your body collapsed onto your straw mat, you didn't sleep with peace. You slept with tension still curled inside your spine. With muscles twitching. With ears still listening for bells. Because sleep was not escape. It was a pause. A breath between one storm and the next. You may have imagined that being a servant was simply hard work. But one day proved it was more than that. It was vanishing. It was surviving inside silence. It was endurance turned into identity. And no matter how strong you thought you were, one day would be enough to unravel you. Because the cruel truth is, medieval servants didn't live day to day. They endured eternity. One day at a time. Let's begin, quietly, with the idea of waking up in a cold stone room before the rooster even considers crowing. You are lying on a scratchy straw mattress, sharing the cramped, dark servant quarters with 3 others, all snoring in various tones of suffering. Your back aches before you've even moved, the fire is out, and there is no such thing as a blanket thick enough. The draft slips through the walls as if the stones themselves were sighing. And this is the best part of your day. You were born into this. Not chosen. Not offered a job or trained in a skill. You're simply the child of other servants, or perhaps your family owed too much in debt, or perhaps you were just the unlucky one taken in, when your village couldn't feed its own. Whatever the reason, you are now a thing that gets used. Not quite a slave, but never quite free either. A presence that is always expected, rarely acknowledged, and never rewarded. Your first task is to dress in the same woolen tunic you wore yesterday, and the day before that, and the week before. It smells faintly of smoke, manure, and salt from your sweat, not from any seasoning. No one cares what you look like. There are no mirrors. Only quick glances in copper pans, or polished shields if you're lucky. You learn not to care. Vanity is for nobles. You're here to scrub, carry, bow, and vanish. Breakfast? That depends. Sometimes you nibble a crust of hard bread, in the kitchen if no one's looking. Maybe a spoonful of pottage, that's stuck to the pot. But mostly, your stomach stays empty. It growls like a feral dog while you sweep the floor or start the fires, or carry water up 3 flights of stairs. And still, no one sees you. One of your most dreaded duties is the chamber pot. Yes, that one. Carried out in the morning. Cold, heavy, and often full to the brim. You get used to the smell the way a fish gets used to water. You dump it into the cesspit, trying not to splash yourself, knowing you'll wash your hands only with gray water and ashes. The kitchen is its own cruel landscape. You chop vegetables you'll never taste. Knead dough for bread you won't eat. Roast meat that smells like heaven and burns your fingers, but you must not take even a sliver. The cooks are usually angry. The food must be perfect for the master. For you, perfection is getting through the day without being slapped, yelled at, or burned by boiling water. The master's mood is the weather in your world. If he wakes up in anger, your day is thunder. If he drinks too much wine, your night is a storm. If the lady of the house is displeased with your dusting, you may go without food until morning. No trial, no explanation. Just the cold law of being beneath everyone. Servants are supposed to be invisible, but also omnipresent. You must not speak unless spoken to. You must be there before you're called. You must vanish the moment your job is done. You must hear everything, and repeat nothing. If there is gossip, it's dangerous. If there is a scandal, you'll be blamed. Sickness doesn't buy you rest. If you're ill, you still work. There are no days off. No medicine unless you're coughing blood or collapse outright. Even then, you may just be tossed into a corner to recover, or not. And if you die, another servant will be brought in to replace you before your body is cold. On feast days, when the household celebrates and the nobles eat like gluttonous kings, your job becomes a frenzy. You serve steaming food on silver platters, refill cups, fetch candles, mop spills, carry trays, and bow until your back screams. And when it's over, when the nobles are asleep in their soft feather beds, you clean the mess. All of it. And maybe, if you're lucky, you eat scraps from the table before the rats do. Privacy. There is none. Your room is a shared broom closet. Your belongings fit in a rag. If you have a moment to yourself, it's while scrubbing stairs or carrying buckets. Even sleep is not your own, it comes in fits and shivers, always too short. Love and family are dreams, not rights. If you fall in love, you do it in silence. If you marry, it must be approved. If you have children, they too may become servants. There is no legacy but labor. No inheritance but fatigue. Could you run away? Perhaps. But where would you go? There are no cities hiring lost servants. No golden opportunities. Just the same endless tasks in a different manner, or worse, on the streets where cold and hunger are sharper than your master's cane. And so, you stay. You endure. You survive by being small, quiet, and obedient. You grow old early. Your hands thicken with calluses. Your back bends. You laugh rarely, and only with others like you, and only when no one is listening. History doesn't remember you. The castles are remembered. The kings. The lords and their feasts. But who lit their fires? Who brushed their horses? Who scrubbed their linens, made their meals, raised their children? Servants. Dozens. Hundreds. Each one living a life of bone-deep exhaustion, their names forgotten even before they died. So if you, a modern soul, were to step back into that world for just one day, you might think you could handle it. You've worked long hours before. You've had bad bosses. You know what it's like to be tired. But nothing in your life, no job, no shift, no all-nighter, would prepare you for the grinding, endless demands of being a medieval servant. you wouldn't survive one day. Not without food, not without rest, not without dignity. And that's the quiet tragedy of a world built on invisible labor. The story of the medieval servant is one of forgotten lives, one after another, each one lived in the shadows of someone else's castle. There were no rewards, no glory, just work, until your hands gave out, until your breath stopped. And then, another servant would take your place. Sleep now. Let that story settle into your mind like dust on a stone floor. You've survived another day of boring history. You didn't have to carry a bucket. You didn't have to empty a chamber pot. But you remembered those who did. In the dim chill before dawn, long before the manor's noble family stirs in their feather-stuffed beds, the life of a medieval servant has already begun. The servant wakes not to the sound of birdsong or sunlight but to a bell, sharp cold, unrelenting. There is no snoozing, no time to stretch or dream. You rise immediately, because lateness is not tolerated. It is punished. And in a world where everything you are depends on your obedience, you learn quickly to never risk it. The first hours of the day are dedicated not to breakfast or peace, but to service. Lighting fires in rooms too large to ever feel warm. Carrying heavy buckets of icy water down long stone corridors. Scrubbing floors with knees that are already bruised. All this before you are even noticed. Because if the lord or lady sees you before their tea is poured, they will likely not be pleased. You are to exist in the periphery. Always present. Never acknowledged. The manor is a machine, and you are one of its smallest, most replaceable parts. You don't belong to yourself. Your name, your voice, your dreams, they are irrelevant here. What matters is what you can do. How fast, how well, how invisibly. You are always moving, sweeping ashes, stirring porridge, answering bells that ring with no rhythm except the mood of whoever calls them. Every task must be performed perfectly, and yet you receive no thanks. Only punishment if anything falls short. The kitchen is a place of constant motion. Fires roar, pots boil. And the cook, a tyrant in a flour-streaked apron, rules over it all with a heavy wooden spoon and a sharper tongue. You chop. You knead. You scald yourself with hot broth. No one asks if you're tired. No one asks if your feet hurt. They do. But it doesn't matter. Nothing stops until the last plate has been cleared, and then, your work only shifts to the cleaning of it all. Every part of your body aches. Your skin is dry and cracking from soap and water. Your nails are blackened. Your back throbs from bending. But rest is not an option. Even your mealtime, when it comes, is not yours. It is brief, barely enough time to chew. And the food you eat is not the feast above stairs. It is the crusts, the broth, the rejects. And even that must be eaten quietly, quickly, without mess or laughter. You never speak unless spoken to. You never rest unless granted permission. You never complain, even in whispers. Because eyes and ears are everywhere. Gossip can sink you. A single word overheard by the steward, or the latest maid can unravel everything. You learn the art of silence. Of smiling faintly when insulted. Of nodding when blamed for things you didn't do. Because to fight back is to be replaced. And the manor never hesitates to find someone new. You may want to cry. But there is no time. No space. Tears are for those who are free. For those with time to be comforted. In this world, crying is just more noise, more weakness. So you learn to cry inside. Quietly. Without tears. You stop expecting anyone to notice your pain. And eventually, you even stop noticing it yourself. At some point, you begin to fade. Not in the physical sense, you still rise, still scrub, still serve. But something inside you goes dim. You forget what your voice sounds like when it speaks freely. You forget how to laugh. You forget what joy feels like. You become function. A task list in human form. And no one notices. Because the work still gets done. As long as the floor is clean, and the bell is answered, nothing else matters. Even when you think of escape, the thought drifts away. Because where would you go? You have no savings, no family, no clothes that wouldn't mark you as a runaway. Outside the manor, there are woods, and wolves, and strangers who do not ask questions before they punish. So you stay. Not because you want to, but because the alternative is too wide, too wild, too unknown. Fear keeps you here. And fear is a patient warden. The manor itself doesn't change. The same torches flicker against the walls. The same footsteps echo. The nobles come and go, draped in silks, laughing at jokes that are never funny. But you remain. You, and the others like you, silent shadows in the corners, always working, always watching. Time folds in on itself. Was it Monday? Or Friday? You don't know anymore. One day is every day. 1 week is a loop. 1 year is a lifetime. And yet, you stay. Because some small part of you still clings to the idea that this is safer than anything else. That at least here, the cold is familiar. The hunger predictable. The pain measured. There is no kindness, but there is routine. And routine is its own kind of mercy. You know what to expect, even if what you expect is suffering. And finally, at the end of the longest day you have ever lived, though identical to all the ones before, you lie down. Not in a bed, not in comfort, but on straw. In a dark corner, with your shoes beside you and your hands still aching. You close your eyes, but you don't truly rest. You only wait. Because in a few short hours, the bell will ring again. And the cycle will begin again. Without question. Without pause. Without end. That is why you wouldn't survive a day. Not because of the scrubbing, or the weight, or the hunger, but because of what it does to your mind, to your sense of self, to your spirit. A single day as a medieval servant would stretch you thin, fray your soul, show you that survival was not about endurance, it was endurance. Constant, merciless, forever.